Hey everybody, my name is James Hush. I'm a software engineer at NFL, National Football League. Right now I'm focusing on JavaScript. I mostly lean towards front-end performance, developer experience, and automation. One of my coworkers made a joke that I'm a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle because I spend most of my time in the sewers rather than actually messing around a whole lot with CSS. But yeah, this has been a really busy week. We just launched a new NFL.com with brand new homepage on Tuesday, so that was a good time. So we took designs from 8 or 9 years ago, completely redesigned it, brand new header, brand new footer, using React, GraphQL, absolute blast. Easily the best, funnest projects I've worked on in a long time. And one of the key parts of this project that I worked on was the new video player. So here we have this really nice video player. We got these cute little animations going on. You can hover, show closed captions. There's some social share buttons. It looks great. Works in IE 11 too, which was annoying, but we got it doing. We got it working. But let's take a look at this video player with a screen reader and see what it looks like. So if I turn on the screen reader here, you can see we can focus through all the menus in the item using the tab key. We can even focus on everything in the secondary item. So everything's looking good so far. Let's try to focus on this player. Okay, so it didn't focus. Maybe it'll focus after the playlist? No, it didn't. Oh, we can't control this player at all. Well, that's no good. That's not ideal. If you don't have a mouse, you can't control this player. And if you have any sort of visual impairment, you're kind of left out of luck. So that gets me on the topic of this talk. So I'm here to talk about accessibility on the web. I'm going to go over why are we even doing this in the first place? And then I'm going to spend most of my time on play action, which is the NFL new video player, and just go through everything that we had to do to make sure it was keyboard navigable and make sure it didn't cause any accessibility warnings or violations. Then I'll spend the last little bit talking about ways that you can prevent accessibility issues from even popping up in the web using automation. So let's talk about why do this in the first place. So over 7 million people have some sort of visual disability in the United States, and it's the law for websites to meet at least WCAG A-level standards. So what does that even mean? I just had a bunch of words. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a set of guidelines made by W3C, and there's 3 different levels. There's A, AA, and AAA. The higher the level is, generally the trickier it is to implement. So example of an A-level standard would be every image needs an alt tag. That's pretty easy to do, and like if you add an alt tag to an image, it's not going to break anything. It's not going to move you backwards adding alt tags to images. An example of something that's a AAA is there should be no images on the website that are just text. Now that's a lot harder to do because you'd have to go through, especially for something like NFL, go through thousands and thousands of images to find out. So luckily, to be compliant, you have to be single A. So how can we move forward? How can we get these A's out there? So stop using divs or avoid using divs whenever possible. I've noticed a new trend where people forgot about buttons and inputs, and we're remaking buttons with 4 divs and a bunch of JavaScript. It's 2017 right now. HTML5's been out since 2014. If you have a nav, you can use a nav tag. If you have an article, use an article tag. If you have a figure, use a figure tag. That's going to get you like in the right direction to begin with. But not only that, HTML4 has been out since the 90s. And HTML4 has given us a lot of cool stuff that we have taken for granted. My personal favorite is buttons. So buttons have, a lot of people have forgotten about HTML buttons. I've seen a lot of times people use divs instead of buttons, but they're missing out on a ton of accessibility features that are built right into the browser. So for example, buttons by default are focusable. Divs are not by default. So if you have a div with some CSS to style it like a button beside a button and you open up a screen reader, you cannot interact with it by keyboard by default. You can make a div focusable by setting the tab index to 0, but another feature of a button is when you highlight a button with a screen reader, it will read it as a button. So for example, this submit button will say submit button. With a div, it's going to read it as submit group, which is kind of a weird user experience. Another nice feature is buttons receive a click event when you hit spacebar or enter. Divs do not. So if you want to be able to interact with a div after you've added this tab index to it, you have to set up a listener for like a key up event and then read the key codes. And then finally, buttons can be disabled. And disabled buttons are not focusable. So you can add a disabled attribute to a div and style it, but at that point when the screen reader goes through the page, it'll still give you focus of the button that you can't interact with. So just by using a button, you're saving yourself 20 plus lines of JavaScript and a bunch of weird div magic. So a common reason that I see developers, at least on my team, not use buttons at first is by default, the buttons have this weird background and the cursor is like not a pointer. It's just an arrow. Luckily, we have CSS. And by just adding this style, I don't have this on GitHub, so you might have to just take a picture of it to remember. Just adding this style will get you a button that looks like an empty div. So there we go. Next is this volume slider. So this is 2017. How do we make a volume slider? We need at least 6 divs and 40 lines of JavaScript. That's easily the only way. And we should probably do some math with some like bounding box rectangle to figure out like what percentage of white is over the black to add that to the volume. This was actually how it was made first. It was 6 divs and a whole lot of JavaScript. If only there was some sort of HTML element we could use instead. And that would be our good old friend slider, input slider. So if we take a look at this input slider, this is some React code. So there's some curly brackets in here. But input slider gives you a max option, a min option. For this example, 1 represents 100% volume, 0 represents 0 muted volume. And you also have a step amount. So this controls how much the volume slider will step through as you use your keyboard. We can give it a title, so the screen reader will announce it as volume. Say it's type range, so we get that little slider UI. And to do the animations for the mouse enter and mouse leave, we have the mouse enter and mouse leave event listeners. But if we want these mouse enter and mouse leave animations to happen with the keyboard, we can just add an on blur and an on focus. So on focus is like the keyboard equivalent of a mouse enter. So when you tap into something, on focus gets fired. And when you tap away from something, on blur gets fired. In general, I've found that if you have a mouse enter or mouse leave, you probably also want an on blur and on focus. I can't think of a situation where I haven't had to do that yet, but there might be one. And then one of the best parts is if you want to get the value of this range slider, you can just get it from the event current target. So there's a little bit of flow code that tells us that it's an event that has a current target, but we're just getting the value and setting the volume. So one of the reasons people kind of shy away from using these sliders is they're kind of tricky to style. The reason why they're tricky is there's a lot of vendor prefixed differences for styling the sliders. Internet Explorer especially has a really weird way of doing it, where it lets you style the second half and the first half, and no other browser lets you do that. Luckily, I found this really great site that lets you kind of play around with the slider, and it generates the CSS you need that makes it work in every single browser. This was an absolute lifesaver because I already had the styles. I just had to make it accessible, but I was having a hard time figuring out which vendor prefix to use where. So I played around with this website for a while, took the CSS, and then replaced it with the styles I need. Next thing is make sure that HTML on your page is in the right order. Now this is really tricky, especially if you're just viewing it with your eyes, because screen readers use HTML to figure out where to go next. They don't go by where it's positioned on the page with CSS. So we ran into a couple of weird bugs about a month before we were ready to launch with screen readers for NFL, where we would tab through a menu and it would just jump to the other side and then jump back. And we thought, well, that doesn't make it. It just needs to go over there. We want to go play to pause, like that's it. But then after opening up and viewing the source, we noticed that a lot of the elements were absolutely positioned, and so the HTML was, it made sense looking at the HTML while it was jumping all over the place, but by viewing it, the CSS screwed that all up. So we got all that. We changed the divs to buttons. We changed the divs to sliders. We got all this focus stuff going. Now if we try to pull up the video player, fortunately there's still no keyboard focus on it. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out in the first iteration of the video player, if you moused away from it, all the controls would hide. And if you started tapping through it, since we were using display none to hide the controls, display none removes it from the DOM entirely, so it wouldn't get any keyboard focus. So how do we make something invisible, but not invisible at the same time? So if you take a page out of Harry Potter, we have this. We need the invisibility cloak of CSS here. And that's the difference between opacity and visibility. So if you set visibility to visible and opacity to 0, it's still there on the page. You just can't see it. Just like how Harry over there is still there, and someone could bump into him with his invisibility cloak on. So that's how we were able to get around that. And the final result is this over here. So we start tabbing through the menu. And then does it get focus? Yes, it does. And then able to go through the buttons. We're able to control this left and right with our keyboard. It announces the percent of the volume. Share videos all work. And we're going to tap through all the share buttons. Thanks. So another example I want to bring up is the NFL, the new header navigation. I don't know if anyone's been on the old NFL page. That old header was, I can't even describe it. Like, it had more links than any header I've ever seen in my life. And our designers did an amazing job and negotiated a lot less links, which is really cool. But we still have a lot of links to go through. So we actually use that visibility hidden trick in the reverse for the header. So if I show you here, so if we start tabbing through this, we can see it gets here. You want it to go to this magnifying glass, and it does. But if we start tabbing our way backwards and open up the sub-navigation, it starts tabbing through the next part. So the trick behind this is we actually have two lists. We have an unordered list that has news, scores, schedules, standings, video, fantasy. And it also has this expand secondary navigation button. That's the beginning of another unordered list. And so we have an unordered list and an unordered list, and a CSS class that sets visibility to hidden or visible. So the reason why we're doing hidden and visible instead of just doing display none is you can't animate away or to a display none. It just like disappears. It's really tricky to figure out at first. And it took me a couple hours to kind of, with some reading, to figure it out. But the tip here is when you have like navigations or menus, you don't really have to do a whole lot of fancy JavaScript to get accessibility kind of going here. what I would do is I would write out the menu, like I would write out the unordered list on a piece of paper, just so I could see it, and then from there build it out. So now we know how to fix stuff. How do we kind of prevent this from happening in the first place? There's a really great plugin called ESLint A11Y. ESLint JSX A11Y. What this allows you to do is run accessibility checks statically on JSX. So here's a really good one. Anyone who has ESLint installed at work, here's my task for you. Install this plugin and turn on only one rule, the alt tag rule. So what this allows you to do is, this image is missing an alt tag. It tells us. And if we add an alt tag, it fixes it. This may seem like a little thing, and you probably think that you're already adding alt tags to everything. But when I first enabled this rule on our code base, we didn't have a single alt tag on a single NFL Shield logo. So it falls through the cracks. So I highly recommend turn on this plugin, just turn on this one rule, and even set it on warn instead of like fail, and that'll get you in the right direction. Our next line of defense is Protractor accessibility plugin. Protractor is a library that lets you write Selenium end-to-end tests with JavaScript. And this plugin is super, super cool. What it does is it runs the Google Chrome developer tools at the end of your end-to-end test. So if anything that's not caught statically but could be caught at runtime, the error would pop up here. This has helped us find a lot of bugs before they've gone out to production too. And then the last #1 way to make sure this doesn't happen is like open up a screen reader and just try hitting tab. If you try this tomorrow, you're gonna have a frustrating time. It's amazing what little things can fall through the cracks just because you don't check it. The next steps for us is we're gonna maintain our current accessibility tests. Every time I upgrade the linter or the Protractor plugin, we find even more and more accessibility warnings and errors, and they're like the people working on these tools are doing a really great job. In general, use the built-in HTML tags, not just HTML5, but the HTML4 stuff whenever possible. They're really easy to implement when you're starting a new project, but when you're trying to fix that project 2 or 3 weeks before a major launch and you have to change all the HTML around it, it's not easy. And in general, be mindful of accessibility. Just open up the site in a screen reader every once in a while. If you have a QA team, like write out a couple tests for them to perform. It's a lot easier to fix them the sooner you find them. If you liked any of this, I started a newsletter. It's at my website, jameshush.com/tips. And there I post a really small tip every week. I've been posting these tips to my coworkers' Slack, and I've been getting a lot of thumbs up on them. So I feel like they're definitely worth your time. They're only a few sentences long, so they're good to post into your coworkers' Slacks. So it makes it sound like you're learning stuff. But yeah, go check it out. Thanks very much for your time. Hope you learned a little bit about accessibility.
Thank you so much, James. I know at my work, we're actually implementing accessibility, and just the information that James showed off today it's just so good. And it's funny how much you forget about buttons and sections and footer tags and header tags and all these things. So I think we have a little bit of time, so we're going to take a few questions.
What's a good way for testing screen readers? Is there like emulators or different?
So the question was, what's a good way to test screen readers?
Well, like to make your browser a screen reader.
Cool. So in OS 10, there's one built in called VoiceOver. You just hit Command F5 and it'll turn on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's built right into OS 10. For Windows, the popular one is JAWS. I usually just use VoiceOver because I'm using a Mac, and then the QA team.
Special in terms of the browser itself?
No, on Firefox and Safari, you have to go to Preferences and turn on keyboard navigation, but in Chrome, it automatically, everything's fine. So this is one of those things it's okay to just test in Chrome.
How good are the automated tests in Protractor, and how much of it do you end up doing manually?
They're fine. They're completely okay. So the thing with accessibility stuff is there isn't a way to like mathematically like make it perfect. It's more like it's kind of like designing. It's like making a design that's the best design. You can't. There's too much ambiguity with some of the rules. But the Protractor tools it is worth implementing if you're serious about getting this working, because half the battle is it's like testing in IE. A lot of people we just don't, and so just by having these rules running and catching some of it, it helps keep everything in good shape.
Earlier on, you talked about that standard, the one that had like A, AA, AAA.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, how different is that, or is it taken over from A, R, I, A?
Oh, for ARIA? So the question was,
They measure two different levels of accessibility?
so the question was, what's the difference between WCAG, AA, AAA, and ARIA, ARIA? So ARIA is actually part of is part of W3C, and ARIA lets you add there are like different properties you can add to divs and HTML elements that can make them more accessible. I didn't really cover them too much because I firmly believe that just using the buttons and using sliders gets you more than 90% of the way there. And more often than not, the ARIA things you add to the divs just put you in the wrong direction. Because in order to do something that a button normally does, you have to add a bunch of ARIA elements. So ARIA is like a set of tools you use to try to hit those AA, AAA standards.
Is there like a tool or website that you can like plug in your website into get a grade back from WCAG?
Sure.
And if not, or if you fail, then can you be sued?
So the question was, is there like a tool or a website that you can use to check? And there's a Chrome plugin called Chrome Accessibility Developer Tools. There's another one by DeQ, I can't remember the name, DeQ University called AXE, A-X-E. That one gets hardcore, and that checks for stuff that isn't even in the standard. But you could, getting sued is something we have to worry about as an organization in NFL. Luckily, that's not happened at all. I mean, it's happened for other stuff, but not for web-related stuff. Yeah, start with the Chrome developer tools. That one helps a lot.
Thanks for sharing your experience with us. I want this is more like a comment. You guys pointed out that it's to comply with the law and also be nice to special population.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we've got to look at it that this is really a profit center too. Because we have to keep in mind that all the search engines are essentially visually challenged.
Mm-hmm.
And they find it the same way that special population visually challenged people find it. And also, if you don't comply with accessibility requirements, the page rank goes wrong.
Yes.
So, in order to be ranked higher, which directly we know translates into money, we need to be fully compliant as much as you can.
And the big one for that is alt tags on images. Like, if you can't sell alt tags to images on your boss with accessibility, you can sell it to him or her with this will improve search engine optimization. And another good tool, this just reminded me, there's a new tool by Google called Lighthouse that gives you like an accessibility score and also gives you like a performance score and I think performance, accessibility, and what does it do anything else? Those are the two main ones. And it makes sure checks if it's mobile friendly. Oh, PWA, Progressive Web App thing. Oh, the share link in the video player? Okay, let me remember, how did I do that? So the question was, in the video, when you turn on the share modal, there's 4 different share links, and then you're able to tab to those share buttons. I can't quite remember. There's either 2 ways I did it. One, the HTML is below in like the markup, but it's just put up above with styling. But another way that I've done I had to do this for the header, for one really specific edge case for the mobile header, is on the click event or the key press event, I just set the focus to that element. And normally that's not like the best way to do it, but sometimes, you know, life just finds a way. You gotta do what you gotta do.
All right, let's give a round of applause for James.